That's what I'm going to talk about today is how can we use measurements of livestock foraging kinetics to inform managers about how their animals are responding to rangeland forage conditions. And I think there's a lot of information being collected by on-animal sensors about grazing behaviors that we're not necessarily using as effectively as we possibly could be. So this work is work that I did in collaboration with E.J. Raynor. I'm standing in for him today as he was originally planning to present here, and he's been leading a lot of this. And also in collaboration with Justin Durner, Sean Kearney, and Kathy Soder. All of us are with USDA's Agricultural Research Service. Okay, I'm trying to get this stuff forward. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about specific trials that we've been doing with two different types of on-animal sensor technologies. The one on the left is the Mooniter Collar. This is a product made by a company in Israel, and it combines GPS locations with an accelerometer. This is a real-time device in that it has communication with the manager via satellite. So you have to pay a satellite fee per year if you want to have that communication. And it's a solar powered collar, so you don't have the battery limitations that Derek was talking about earlier. But I'll talk about some of the problems with it later, logistic wise, but what I'm going to really look at is how can we use the combination of grazing behaviors assessed by the accelerometer in combination with the GPS locations to assess animal performance. And then the one on the right is, this is a steer wearing a RumaWatch halter. That band going over the nose measures bite rates. And then below its mouth, it's also wearing a GPS collar. The RumaWatch is a German company. It was designed mostly for dairies, but I'll talk about our attempts to use it in with free-ranging cattle. So all the work I'll show you today is done at the Central Plains Experimental Range using yearling steers during the growing season. CPR is a long-term agroecosystem research site within USDA ARS. And so the LTAR network is what's funded this work. And it's in short grass steppe with a precipitation of about 13 inches, so semi-arid grassland. First study I want to tell you about is one where we selected 4 pastures to represent a range of forage availability. These are 320 acres or 130 hectares each. One had relatively high standing forage biomass because it's dominated by C3 midgrasses growing on sandy soils. The second one had a moderate forage biomass because it's a mixture of short grasses and midgrasses. And then we selected 2 pastures that had unusually low forage availability. Pasture 3 here because it's been grazed at a heavy stocking rate for the past 70 years, which has really removed the C3 grasses and maintained it in a very short blue grama lawn. And then the 4th pasture also has very low standing forage biomass because it's got C3 and C4 grasses mixed through it, but it has a large prairie dog colony present in it, where prairie dogs are present on about 46 to 87% of the pasture, depending on the year, and maintain the vegetation in a very low biomass state. So what we wanted to see is how do cattle perform in terms of weight gains across these 4 sets of conditions, and what do the Mooniter collars tell us about how these animals are behaving in terms of their foraging behavior within each. First of all, to monitor standing herbaceous biomass, we used a product that was just developed by Sean Kearney with ARS. And this is where he's been using the harmonized Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 imagery to generate daily estimates of standing forage biomass. It's a combination of both live and dead herbaceous biomass at a 30-meter pixel resolution. And then we can use that to generate at the pasture scale estimates of forage biomass. So this is our 4 study pastures during the growing season of 2019. And you can see the high biomass pasture reached all the way up to 1,100 kilograms per hectare at peak biomass. The other ones were down at about 700. And later in the season, during 2019, we had a pretty rapid rate of senescence during the growing season. This is x-axis here is day of grazing season, where 0 is May 1st. and then 116 is the beginning of October, or 160 is the beginning of October. So between days 80 and 100, we had a real substantial decline in forage availability due to plant senescence. And then we studied the steers during the latter part of this growing season. So steers were weighed on day 100 and day 153 to get a late season weight gain measurement. And then we deployed the collars for a 3-week period there towards the end of the season in each pasture. We did this again in 2020. 2020 was a drought year, so we didn't get a very large accumulation of biomass early in the growing season, but from about day 10 to day 70, when we, again, this black box shows the beginning and the end of the solid black box shows when we weighed animals to get a weight gain estimate. And then the dashed box shows when we deploy the Mooniter collars. Again, we had it, this is green and rapidly growing vegetation, not high biomass, but not too limiting either. And then we did this later in the summer. Again, a 60-day weight gain period with the collars deployed during that interval. Early in the season, green growing vegetation, crude protein at 17%. Late in the season, low biomass senescent vegetation down at crude protein at 12%. So this is an example of the Mooniter collars. On the left, we have been using them on cow-calf herds as well, but what I'll show today is for steers here on the right in short grass, and they collect a GPS location every 5 minutes and an activity record every 4 seconds. And there's a proprietary algorithm on board that takes the accelerometer data, and every 4 seconds for that interval, it tells you whether the animal's grazing, resting, or walking. EJ and I did a bunch of tests, analyses with direct observations of cattle wearing these collars, and the activity prediction does seem to be pretty accurate. So what I'm going to show you is we want to calculate daily metrics of foraging behavior. And the 4 we really focused on, the first 2 are from the accelerometers, and then 2 are derived from the GPS. The first one is time spent grazing. We calculated this 2 different ways. One is the sum of 4-second intervals spent grazing each 24-hour period. The second one is the sum of all 5-minute intervals where at least half of that interval was spent grazing during each 24-hour period. And then we also calculated grazing bout duration. So this is the mean length of intervals where the animal is grazing continuously at a 4-second resolution. Anytime it stops grazing for 4 seconds, we call that a new grazing bout. And then we also calculated the grazing bout duration at a 5-minute temporal resolution, where anytime an animal stops grazing for a whole 5 minutes, then that's the end of a grazing bout. We start a new one. And what we did was we calculate the mean grazing bout duration, the mean length of grazing meals during each 24-hour period. And then we also calculated mean turn angle while grazing. And this is only for anytime the animal, as shown on the bottom of this slide, anytime the animal is estimated to be grazing for a 10-minute period, where we get 3 different GPS fixes, say one at 10:05, one at 10:10, and one at 10:15. We then calculate the turn angle while it is grazing, and we take the mean turn angle while grazing during the day. So this is a measure of the tortuosity of the grazing pathway. And then finally, we calculate the mean velocity while grazing. So for each of these 5-minute steps where the animal's grazing, we calculate meters per minute moved. And what we then asked is we averaged these behavioral metrics for each of those 3 study periods and different pastures. And we asked what metrics best predict animal weight gain. And what we found is that 2 metrics in particular were quite good at identifying variation in animal weight gain in space and time. So this upper panel on the x-axis, it's showing grazing bout duration calculated at a 5-minute resolution. This 5-minute resolution calculation seemed to work better than the 4-second one. Then on the y-axis is average daily weight gain of the animals in kilograms per animal per day. What you can see is as the grazing bout duration increases, weight gain declines. And then on the lower panel is mean velocity while grazing. And as the animals cover more ground while they're grazing in each 5-minute interval, that is correlated with increasing weight gain. So they're grazing at about 7 to 9 meters per minute when they're grazing more digestible, palatable forage, and at a slower rate when they're grazing the senescent forage. So what we learned from this is that grazing bout duration and velocity while grazing were the best behavioral predictors of variation in forage conditions, and that these two parameters together could explain 62% of the variation in animal weight gain across this data set. So I think that's pretty powerful in terms of using behavioral metrics to tell us things that maybe we couldn't perhaps assess just by going out and looking at the animals ourselves. And then finally, grazing time per day and turn angle while grazing, those were both correlated with steer weight gain. So they do seem to have a relationship to animal performance, but in this particular data set, they didn't explain any extra additional variation above and beyond a model based just on grazing bout duration and velocity while grazing. Okay, so that's the first one. Now I'm going to switch over to tell you a little bit about our work with the RumoWatch jaw movement recorders. And this is a halter-based system developed for dairies where we have a pressure sensor tube that goes over the nose and helps to get an estimate of bite rates. So even more detailed than just is the animal grazing, walking, or resting. Oh, and I did want to show, this is just a video. The animal on the left this is a steer grazing with the Mooniter collar on it. And then this is a steer grazing on the right with the GPS collar below its neck, and then the RumoWatch halter over the nose. So the RumoWatch has been validated in a dairy system, and it's been showed to discriminate between bites and chews. And they also found that forage limitation was indicated by increased bite frequency and reduced rumination time. So we wanted to evaluate the use of this halter in free-ranging beef cattle situation. Does it work in heterogeneous rangelands? And what can we learn from measuring bite rates? So we've done some work over the past couple years. This is led by E.J. Raynor, validating the bite rate estimates from direct visual observations. We've been looking at both how well does it measure whether or not the animal is grazing, or how many minutes per hour it's grazing, and then also what is the bite rate. And so that validation study was recently published in a paper 2021 in Applied Animal Behavior Science. And on the right here, it shows that the devices seem to be very accurate in measuring grazing time in terms of like minutes of grazing per hour in the rangeland setting. This is all provided we have an excellent fit between the halter and the shape of the animal's head. In terms of bite rate, we did get good correlations, but not as strong as with grazing time. In terms of observed bites on the X versus measured bites on the Y, across all types of swards, whether it's short grass or mixed grass, we got a pretty good correlation between observed bites and measured. The lowest correlation was in short grass, where the bite rates are quite high and the bites are small. So we use this to look at variation in total bites per day taken by steers in short grass swards versus mixed grass or mid-grass swards stocked at the same stocking rate. So on the left, it's blue grama. On the right, it's Western wheat and needle and thread, so larger bites. And we did this in an average year and a drought year with low production. And just some initial findings are kind of interesting. First of all, under conditions where in 2019, a more average year, much higher bite rates in the short grass, so compared to mid-grass swards. So animals are significantly increasing their bite rates when they're on in response to the smaller bite size that they're experiencing in short grass swards. In the swards with a higher biomass mid-grass, we see anywhere from about 17 to 23,000 bites per day, whereas the short grass typically above 25,000 bites per day. In the mid-grass swards, as the swards become depleted, bite rates go up. So that is an indicator. The increasing bite rates there seem to be an indicator of initial forage limitation. But then in these short grass swards and late in the drought, we saw a huge crash in total bites per day because the animals just couldn't compensate with increasing bite rate because the sward was too short. So the initial conclusion there is bites per day initially increases with declining sward height or biomass, but if the biomass declines below a critical threshold, we need more work to determine where these are. Cattle can no longer compensate with increased bite rate. And as a result, the total grazing time per day and total bites per day both decline substantially. So in terms of next steps, what we want to do, the halter system, I should have mentioned earlier, this is just a store on board system. So it's not yet in a real-time type technology, but it certainly has the potential to transmit through LoRa or something like that. But what we're doing right now, just with the store on board, is trying to combine the halter jaw movement recorder with a high frequency GPS collar, and then combine that with high resolution mapping from satellites of plant community composition. So in the lower left here, this is an example of a plant community map from a pasture, and then it's overlaid with the foraging pathway of a steer for 24 hours. And what we can do is classify where it's grazing at high bite rates in dark blue versus where is it grazing at low bite rates in light blue, and how do those bite rates change as they switch plant communities, and how does that relate to animal performance? So what we're hoping to do with some of this is to look at spatially explicit forage intake rates, try to identify pasture performance hotspots in space and time, and develop behavior-based indices of forage limitation for different ecological sites. And ultimately, I do think this can help us inform herd rotation and stocking density decisions, particularly if we can get to a point, as Colin and Derek both noted, where these devices are actually cattle proof and can reliably collect this information and transmit it to us on a daily or every other day type of basis. I will say, and one last thing in conclusion, the Mooniter systems and the halter-based systems, we still have a long way to go in making them cattle proof. With the solar panel, that collar can be left out year round, but we do still have about 50% loss of collars due to breakage and damage to the solar panels after about 2 years of operation. So lots of issues with logistics to overcome, but I still think the concepts of using behavioral indices calculated from these behavioral sensors can tell us a lot about how the animals are performing.